It's just a bike. That was what he said. Laughing, phone out, recording. He had no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The woman standing in that parking lot said nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at what was left of her father's motorcycle. Broken mirrors, scratched paint, a fuel tank dented like someone had kicked it for fun, and she made one phone call. 30 minutes later, the desert road filled with headlights. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The last time Claire Whitmore heard her father's voice, he was standing in the garage with grease on his hands and a crescent wrench tucked into his back pocket, talking to her the way he always talked. Slow, deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't rush because it didn't need to. "Claire," he said, not looking up from the fuel tank he was wiping down with a clean rag. "You know what's inside this thing?" She was 18 years old and thought she knew everything. "Gas," she said. He didn't laugh. He set the rag down and put his hand flat against the side of the tank. The black 2009 Harley Road King that had carried him through 3 states, 2 divorces, and 1 bypass surgery. And he said, "No, that's not what's inside." She waited. "Every mile I ever rode," he said quietly. "Every time I didn't give up. Every morning I got up when I didn't want to." He picked the rag back up. "That's what's inside." Claire thought about that conversation for the next 24 years. She thought about it the night he died. She thought about it when she drove his Harley home from the hospital parking lot, barely able to see the road through the grief that had swallowed her whole. And she thought about it on a Friday night in October, in a small Arizona desert town called Ridgecrest, when she walked out of a roadside diner called the Dusty Spoon and found 4 strangers standing around her father's bike. The first thing she noticed was the sound, laughter, not the casual kind, the sharp, deliberate kind that comes from people who want to be heard. She heard it before she pushed open the glass door, heard it over the jukebox still playing inside, over the hiss of the grill and the low murmur of other diners. She heard it cutting through all of that, and something in her stomach tightened the way it always did when she heard that particular sound, the sound of someone enjoying something they had no right to enjoy. She pushed the door open, and she stopped. 4 of them, young, early 20s maybe, 2 in baseball caps, 1 in a sleeveless shirt that showed a tattoo she couldn't read from where she stood, and 1 holding a phone up like he was filming something important. They were standing around her Harley, or rather they were standing around what had been her Harley. The left mirror was gone. Not cracked, gone. The bracket was bent sideways like someone had grabbed it with both hands and twisted until it came loose. The right side of the tank had a long scratch, raw silver metal showing through the black paint, the kind of scratch that only comes from a key dragged deliberately from one end to the other. The leather seat, the original leather seat her father had restitched himself back in 2013, the seat he'd spent 3 weekends on while listening to Merle Haggard records, had a fresh gash across the center. The one with the phone was narrating. "Somebody left their grandma bike out here, bro. Watch this." He kicked the front fender. Claire didn't scream. She didn't run forward. She stood there, and for a moment, just a moment, she was not a 42-year-old woman in a parking lot in Arizona. She was 18 again, standing in her father's garage, and she could feel his voice against the back of her throat the way you can feel a word you're not ready to say yet. Then she walked forward. "Tita-san." She didn't make noise when she walked. She never had. 2 decades of military service had built that into her body. Move quietly, assess quickly, don't telegraph your position until you know what you're walking into. She crossed the parking lot and came to a stop 6 feet from the nearest one, the one in the sleeveless shirt, and she said, "Step away from my bike." Her voice was calm, completely, absolutely calm. The one in the sleeveless shirt turned around slowly. He took his time with it, looked her up and down, the kind of look designed to make someone feel small, and smiled. "Your bike?" he said. "Yes." He looked back at his friends. "Hear that? This thing is her bike." He made a face that passed for disbelief. "You sure, sweetheart? Because I don't see a name on it." "My name is on the registration," Claire said, "which is in the saddlebag, which you are welcome to check." The one with the phone swung around to face her now, still filming. She could see herself in the small, bright square of his screen, short, blonde, in a leather jacket, standing in a parking lot at 10 o'clock at night, Oh, we got a tough one, he said, grinning at the camera. Hey, biker lady, we were just having a little fun. You scratched the paint, Claire said. You broke the mirror. You cut the seat. Accidents happen. No, she said, they don't. Not like this. Something shifted, not in her voice. That stayed level, stayed quiet. But something in her eyes, some quality of attention, some stillness that didn't belong in a parking lot confrontation with drunk 20-year-olds. The one in the sleeveless shirt felt it first. His smile thinned slightly, like a cloud passing in front of something. Look, he said, crossing his arms. It's just a bike. What's the problem? And then Claire Whitmore said the thing she would say later, the thing people would repeat for months afterward in diners and garages and at rallies from Phoenix to Memphis. No, she said quietly. It's not just a bike. It's someone's story. So, the one with the phone laughed. It was a performance laugh, the kind meant for the recording, not for the moment. Someone's story, he repeated, tilting the phone toward her. That's real deep, lady, real deep. But here's the thing. He gestured around the empty parking lot. There's nobody here to care about your story, so why don't you just call your insurance and move on? Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and pulled out her phone. The one in the sleeveless shirt snorted. What are you doing? Making a phone call, she said. To who, the cops? He shrugged. Go ahead. By the time they get here, we'll be gone. Claire didn't answer him. She found the contact she was looking for, pressed call, and held the phone to her ear. The one with the camera phone kept filming. The call connected after 2 rings. Ray, Claire said. It's Claire. I'm at the Dusty Spoon in Ridgecrest, off Route 60. She paused, listening. No, I'm fine, but someone got into my father's bike. Another pause. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yeah, it's bad. She listened for another moment. No, Ray, I'm not asking for anything. She looked directly at the one who had kicked her fender. I just wanted someone to know where I was. She hung up. The one in the sleeveless shirt stared at her. Who's Ray? A friend, Claire said. What's he going to do about it? Nothing, she said. I didn't ask him to do anything. Something about the answer unsettled the one in the sleeveless shirt. He couldn't have explained why. She hadn't threatened them. She hadn't cried or begged or bargained. She just made a phone call, said almost nothing, and put her phone away. And now she was standing there looking at the damage on her motorcycle with an expression he couldn't read. You're acting like this is some kind of big deal, he said, trying to reclaim the ground he didn't realize he'd already lost. Claire crouched down slowly beside the front fender. She ran one finger along the scratch on the tank, the long silver line where the paint had been scraped away. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she stood up. You know what my father told me? She said. Nobody answered. He said a motorcycle isn't made of metal. She looked at the one with the phone. He said it carries someone's memories. The one with the phone kept filming but didn't say anything. This bike carried his memories for 30 years, she said, and I've carried them since. She looked at the broken mirror bracket. And you touched it like it was nothing. Lady, I'm not angry at you, she said, and she meant it completely. I'm sad for you, because nobody ever taught you that things have weight. The parking lot was very quiet. The jukebox had stopped inside. Through the diner window, a few other customers had drifted toward the glass, watching without knowing what they were watching. The one with the phone finally lowered it. He almost said something. He didn't. Then Claire sat down on the wooden step beside the diner entrance, and she waited. She wasn't waiting for the police. She hadn't called them yet. She wasn't waiting for a tow truck, though she'd need one eventually. She was waiting because 37 minutes after she hung up with Ray, she heard something that she recognized before she saw anything. A sound that started as a vibration in the asphalt under her boots before it became a noise, before the noise became a rumble, before the rumble became the thing it was. Engines, lots of them. The one in the sleeveless shirt heard it too. He'd been leaning against his own car, arms crossed, waiting for nothing in particular, with the low-level confidence of someone who believed the world sorted itself in his favor. He heard the engines, and his arms uncrossed, and he stood up straight. The first headlight appeared at the far end of the road, then another, then 5. Then, because the desert road ran flat and straight for 2 miles before the diner, and you could see everything coming long before it arrived. He watched as the headlights multiplied. 10, 15. He started counting and lost count, and that was when he realized he had miscounted the situation from the beginning. The sound hit the parking lot like weather. Motorcycles, Harleys, most of them, some with high bars, some with low, some with sidecars, all of them black and chrome, and moving in formation with a precision that was not aggressive and was therefore worse than aggressive. They filled the road. They peeled into the parking lot in a wide, practiced arc, and they parked, one by one, in a half circle that closed around the diner like a parenthesis. The engine shut down, one by one. The last engine cut out, and then there was silence so complete that the one with the camera phone could hear his own heartbeat. He had not pressed record again. 51 motorcycles. He counted them later when he was trying to explain what had happened. 51 motorcycles, and the riders were getting off them, unhurried, and they were wearing the colors. The patch on the back, the red and white. The one in the sleeveless shirt's voice came out differently than he intended. "Who are these people?" he said. Claire looked up from where she was sitting. "Friends," she said. One. A man named Raymond Cortez walked through the parked motorcycles, hands in his jacket pockets, moving like someone who had been in situations that made this one look manageable. He was 60 years old, built like someone had assembled him from spare truck parts, with a white beard and dark eyes that were warm in a way that was somehow more frightening than cold. He walked to Claire first. He looked at the bike. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Rudy's bike." "Yeah," Claire said. Ray Cortez had known Rudy Whitmore for 40 years, had ridden with him from Arizona to the Gulf Coast 3 times, had been at his hospital bed the last week, had stood beside Claire at the grave. He looked at the broken mirror. He looked at the scratched tank. He looked at the cut seat. Then he turned around and looked at the 4 young men, and he didn't say anything at all. He didn't have to. One of them, the shortest, the youngest looking, the one who had mostly stood near the car and not said much, sat down on the parking lot asphalt. Just sat down, like his legs had made a decision his brain hadn't caught up to. Ray let the silence work for another few seconds. Then he walked toward the 4 of them, stopped 10 feet away and said in a voice so reasonable it was almost kind, "You want to tell me what happened here?" The one in the sleeveless shirt opened his mouth. "It was..." He stopped, started again. "We didn't know whose bike it was." Ray said. "We were just..." "I know what you were doing," Ray said. He tilted his head toward the phone still in the cameraman's hand. "You were filming it." The cameraman's hand moved instinctively, like he was going to put the phone in his pocket. Ray looked at the hand and the hand stopped moving. "I'd like to see that video," Ray said. It's just a..." "I'd like to see it," Ray said again. The boy held out the phone. Ray watched it. He watched it without expression. The laughing, the kicking, the narration, the whole performance. And he handed the phone back. "Okay," he said. He turned and walked back to Claire. "What do you want to do, Cross?" he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Nothing drastic," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Claire." "Ray, I mean it." He looked at the bike again. The broken mirror. The scratch that had gone through the paint, down to the bare metal, right across the place where her father had put his hand 24 years ago, and said, "Every mile I ever rode." His jaw moved. He was working something out behind his teeth. "Okay," he said. "Your call." "I want them to understand what they did," she said. "Not what it cost to fix it. What it meant." Ray was quiet for a moment. "You know that's harder than anything else I could do to them," he said. "I know," Claire said. "That's why I want to do it." The police arrived 19 minutes after one of the diner waitresses called them. A young deputy named Torres who pulled into the parking lot, looked at the 51 parked motorcycles, the 4 pale-faced young men in a cluster near a sedan, and one blonde woman sitting on a step, and took approximately 10 seconds to assess that the situation was complicated. He approached Claire first. "Ma'am, you the one whose property was damaged?" "Yes, sir." "You know these riders?" "Yes," she said. "They're with me." Torres looked at the half circle of Hell's Angels. He looked back at Claire. He looked at the damaged Harley. "Right," he said. "Okay, can I see everyone's ID?" What followed was 40 minutes of documentation. Statements, photographs, the video pulled from the cameraman's phone with his reluctant consent, the registration confirming that the bike was titled to Claire E. Whitmore and had been for 11 years, and the original title before that to Rudolph G. Whitmore for 22 years before his death. Torres looked at the history of the title for a moment. "This was your father's bike?" he said. "Yes," Claire said. Torres wrote something in his notebook. He looked at the four young men who had by then given their statements with the kind of careful vagueness that comes from people who are starting to understand exactly how badly they have miscalculated their evening. "Mr. Delacroix," Torres said to the one in the sleeveless shirt, "your statement says you were, quote, just having fun. Is that still what you want on record?" The one named Delacroix looked at his feet. "It was stupid," he said. "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Yeah," Delacroix said. "Yeah, that's what I want on record." Torres closed his notebook. He turned to Claire. "You want to press charges?" And here is where the story stopped being what the four young men expected it to be. Because Claire Whitmore looked at those four boys. And she did see them as boys now, because rage had not clouded her vision, had never clouded her vision. And what she saw without rage was the actual thing. Four young men who had made a choice that came from somewhere. Boredom, maybe. The cheap thrill of power exercised against someone they'd calculated couldn't hit back. The desire to be seen. Someone had been filming. After all, always someone filming, as if the act didn't exist unless it existed for an audience. She had seen men like this before. Not in parking lots, in courtrooms, in VA waiting rooms, in the faces of veterans who had come back from wars and found nobody waiting and nothing to do, and too much time and too little meaning. Men who broke things because they didn't know how to build anything. She had spent 15 years building things. She knew what it looked like when someone had never been taught the difference. "I want to press charges," she said. Torres nodded, reaching for his radio. "But," she said, he stopped. "I want to make a request about the terms." Torres looked at her carefully. "What kind of request?" She told him. His pen stopped moving over the notepad. He looked at the four young men. He looked at the 51 motorcycles. He looked at Claire. "I've never heard anything like that before," he said. "I know," Claire said. "Can you make it happen?" Torres put the cap back on his pen. "I'll make some calls," he said. While Torres was on his radio, Ray Cortez came to stand beside Claire, his hands in his jacket pockets, and said nothing for a long time. That was something she had always loved about Ray. He understood that silence could be a form of company. Finally, he said, "Your dad would have called them all kinds of things." "Yeah," Claire said, "but he would have ended up doing exactly what you're doing." She looked at him. "You know that," Ray said. "Rudy never wasted a lesson, even on people who didn't deserve it." Claire looked at the bike, at the scratch that ran from the front of the tank to the back in one long, deliberate line. "She can be fixed," Ray said. "She can be fixed," Claire agreed. "It's going to take a while. Most good things do." Ray smiled just a little at the corner of his mouth. He pulled a hand out of his pocket and put it briefly on her shoulder. One of those gestures that doesn't need to be long to say everything. 51 bikes, Claire," he said. "You call and 51 bikes show up." "I know," she said. "You know why?" She said nothing. "Because every person out here tonight," he said, looking back at the half circle of riders, "has a story that fits inside a machine. And you spent 15 years helping them tell it." He looked at her. "You're not just a mechanic. You're the reason some of those people are still riding." She looked at the parking lot full of headlights and leather and chrome, all of it quiet now. All of those people who had answered one phone call at 10 o'clock on a Friday night in a desert town. She didn't say anything, because there are moments when words are technically possible, but wholly unnecessary. Later, after the police report was filed, after the tow truck came for the Harley, after the four young men drove away in their sedan, with court dates in their future, Ray gathered the riders. They stood in the parking lot, the 51 of them, and Claire stood in the middle of them, and she said, "Thank you for coming." One of the riders, a woman about Claire's age with gray-streaked hair and a jacket covered in pins, said, "Claire, we would have come for nothing. You know that." "I know," Claire said. "Where's the bike going?" "My shop," Claire said. "It'll take some time." "We want to help," the woman said. "I know you do." "So let us." Claire looked at all of them, at the faces she recognized, people she'd worked on bikes for, people who'd come to her when they couldn't afford anywhere else, People who'd brought her coffee on late nights in the garage and sat with her in the silence of someone working through grief with their hands. The boys that did this, she said, they're going to be working in my shop too. The parking lot went very still. Part of the court order, Claire said, if the judge agrees, I asked them to work alongside us, learn what the bike meant, meet the people I work for. The silence held for a moment. Then the woman with the pins on her jacket said quietly, that's either the bravest thing I ever heard or the craziest. Claire almost smiled. Rudy always said those were the same thing, she said. Someone in the back of the group laughed, a real laugh, a warm one, and then somebody else joined it, and the sound of it rose up into the desert night and dissolved into the stars. And Claire Whitmore stood in the middle of it and felt her father's bike already on its way to being whole again. Not because the metal would be repaired, but because the story would go on. That was the thing about stories. They didn't end because someone scratched them. They went on. They always went on. The tow truck left at midnight. Claire watched it go. She stood in the parking lot of the Dusty Spoon until the red tail lights disappeared around the bend in Route 60. And then she stood there a little longer because there was something about watching the Harley leave on the back of a flatbed that felt like watching a piece of herself being carried away by strangers. She knew it was irrational. She knew the bike was going to her own shop, to the garage where she had spent 15 years putting broken things back together. She knew all of that. It didn't change the feeling. Ray had offered to drive her home. She told him no. He'd offered 3 more times after that, in the way Ray always did. Not pushy, just persistent, the way a man gets when he's been around long enough to know that the people who say they're fine are usually the last people who are. I'll call Marcus, she said. He's 20 minutes away. Marcus is 22 years old and drives like he's auditioning for something, Ray said. He'll be fine. Claire. Ray. She looked at him and he stopped because he'd known her long enough to recognize a specific quality of that look. The one that meant the decision was made and the conversation about the decision was over. Go home. Kiss Linda. I'll call you in the morning. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Rudy used to make that same face, he said. I know, she said. I learned it from him. He hugged her once, solid, brief, the kind of hug that carries weight. And then he got on his bike, and one by one the parking lot emptied. Engines firing in the desert night like a slow thunderstorm moving away, until the last taillight vanished, and Claire was alone with the sound of the highway and the faint smell of exhaust, and the way the parking lot asphalt looked under the fluorescent diner light when there was nothing left on it. She sat back down on the step. She pulled out her phone. She did not call Marcus. She opened her photo gallery instead, and she scrolled back, not far because she knew exactly where it was, to a photograph she had taken 8 months ago, the morning after she finished the first full restoration of her father's bike after a minor highway incident had bent the front fork. She'd worked on it for 6 weeks. When she was done, she'd rolled it out into the morning and taken one photograph before she wrote it, before anything else, just the bike in the early light. She looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she put the phone in her pocket, stood up and went inside to ask the waitress if she could get a coffee to go. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, set a styrofoam cup on the counter without being asked. On the house, she said. Claire looked at her. Honey, I watched that whole thing through the window, the woman said. I'm the one who called the police. She paused. I'm also the one who refilled your coffee 4 times while you were sitting in that booth before all this happened. And you said thank you every single time without looking up from whatever you were thinking about. She pushed the cup closer. People who say thank you when they don't have to are people who deserve coffee. Claire almost smiled. Thank you, she said. The waitress pointed at her. See, you just did it again. Claire took the coffee. What was it? The waitress said. The bike. What was it to you? Claire looked down at the styrofoam cup in her hands. My father built his whole life on that machine, she said. Not on it, around it. Every vacation we ever took, every Saturday morning, every hard week that needed a long ride at the end of it. When he got sick, he used to sit in the garage and just put his hand on it. Didn't ride it, just sat there with it. She paused. I think it was the one thing that made him feel like himself when everything else was trying to convince him he was becoming someone else. The waitress was quiet for a moment. My husband had a truck like that, she said, a 1978 Ford. He passed 3 years ago. She straightened a napkin holder that didn't need straightening. I still have the truck. I can't drive it, can't sell it either. She looked up. Some things just hold people, even after the person's gone. Claire nodded. She drank her coffee standing at the counter, and the two of them didn't talk much after that. And it was one of those silences that feel like company instead of absence. And by the time Claire walked out to wait for her ride, she felt not better exactly, but steadier. The way you feel after someone reminds you that you are not the first person to carry something heavy. That was the night that started everything. But the thing about nights like that, the thing nobody tells you, is that they don't end when the sun comes up. They just change shape. They become the thing you wake up thinking about. They become the first call you make in the morning and the last thought before you sleep. They become the story that rewrites itself every time you look at the empty space where the bike should be. And for Claire Whitmore, that story was about to get considerably more complicated. Because 3 days after the parking lot, she got a phone call that had nothing to do with the Harley. It had to do with Desert Freedom Garage, and the news was not good. The call came from a man named Gerald Fitch, and Gerald Fitch was the kind of man whose voice told you everything before he said a single word of substance. Careful, measured, trailing with the particular hesitation of someone delivering news they would prefer to be delivering to someone else. Claire, he said, I need to talk to you about the lease renewal. Gerald Fitch owned the building on Cochise Street where Desert Freedom Garage had operated for 11 years. He had inherited it from his mother, who had rented it to Claire's father first and then to Claire after Rudy died, at a rate that had not changed in a decade because Rudy Whitmore had been the kind of man who inspired loyalty in people almost without trying. Gerald Fitch, however, was not his mother. I've had an offer, Gerald said. Claire set down the wrench she was holding. What kind of offer, she said. A commercial one, development company out of Scottsdale. They want the whole block, actually. It's not just your building. He cleared his throat. They've been talking to everyone on the street for the past 6 months. 6 months, Claire repeated. I should have told you sooner, I know that. Gerald, the lease renewal is in 30 days. I know. I have 8 veterans scheduled for work in the next 2 months alone. I have 2 bikes mid-restoration. I have equipment that... Claire, he exhaled. I'm not saying it's done. I'm saying I need you to know where things stand. They're offering 3 times what the building is worth on paper. I have my own situation. My mother left some debts that I'm still working through, and this would... How much time do I have? She said. A pause. If I sign with them, they need 30 days to process the paperwork. Your lease technically wrote in 28 days, 2 days less than she needed. She let that sit for a moment. What would it take for you not to sign? She said. Gerald Fitch was quiet for a long time. Claire, I don't want to put a number on... Gerald, what would it take? Another pause. Then quietly, more than I think you have right now. She didn't respond. I'm sorry, he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. After she hung up, she stood in the middle of her shop. Not the shop on Cochise Street. She was at her house, in the smaller personal garage where she'd brought the Harley on the flatbed 3 nights ago, where the bike was now sitting under a tarp because she hadn't been able to look at it yet. Not fully, not with the measuring eye that tells you how much is broken. She stood between her workbench and the tarped shape of her father's motorcycle, and she said to no one, "Okay, Dad." She said it the way she always said it when things were pointing in all the wrong directions at once. Okay. She pulled the tarp off the Harley. She looked at it. She picked up the wrench she'd set down before Gerald called, and she went to work. There is a particular kind of person who processes grief through their hands, and Claire Whitmore was that person completely. She had always been. When her mother left when Claire was 11, she had spent the following summer in the garage with her father, learning to change oil and adjust brakes and true wheels. Not because she particularly cared about oil or brakes or wheels at 11, but because her hands were busy, and her hands being busy meant her mind had somewhere to put itself. That was not the empty seat at the kitchen table. When she came back from her last deployment with a shoulder injury that ended her military career, She rebuilt 3 motorcycles in 4 months. Friends thought it was therapy. It was, but not in the way they understood therapy. It wasn't about processing. It was about the simple contract between a broken thing and the person willing to fix it. You put in the work, the thing gets better. There was no ambiguity in that. There was no waiting to see if it would work out. You did the work, and the work was the answer. She worked on the Harley for 3 hours that morning. She was not trying to fix it. That would take weeks. She was assessing, which was different, learning the damage, mapping it, deciding what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced from scratch. The scratch on the tank was deep but clean. The mirror bracket was bent past straightening, but the mount itself was intact. The seat was the worst of it. Not just the cut, but the fact that the leather was original. 40-year-old leather that her father had restitched himself, and there was no replacing 40-year-old leather with something that carried the same weight. She was staring at the seat, thinking about this, when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Is this Claire Whitmore?" A young voice, male, careful. Yes, she said. My name is Daniel Reeves." A pause. "I was at the Dusty Spoon on Friday night." Claire was still. "I was the one filming," he said. She said nothing. He stopped, started again. "I wanted to call and say that I know that doesn't fix anything. I know that, but I wanted to." Another stop. "I looked you up after everything. I looked up your shop, Desert Freedom Garage. I read about what you do." "Okay," Claire said. "I didn't know," he said. "Not that that matters. I know that doesn't make it better." "No," she said, "it doesn't." A long pause. "My uncle was in the army," Daniel said. "He came back with a bad leg, never talked about it much. He has a motorcycle. He bought it 2 years ago, said it was the first thing that made him feel like he could go somewhere again." His voice changed slightly, got quieter. "I never thought about it that way. That a bike could do that for someone. I didn't think." "I know you didn't," Claire said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough either." "Daniel," Claire said. "Yeah. Where do you live?" A pause. "What? Where do you live? What part of the valley?" "Mesa," he said. "Why?" She looked at the Harley, at the damaged seat, at all the work waiting to be done. "You know how to use tools?" she said. A very long pause. "I like basic stuff. My dad had a workbench." "Come to my shop," she said. "Cochise Street in Phoenix, tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Silence. "I don't understand," he said. "You said you wanted to make it better," Claire said. "I'm telling you how, Sam." She called Ray that night. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting, which was typical of Ray. "How's the bike?" he said. "Repairable," she said, "but it's going to take a while." "Good, what else?" She told him about Gerald Fitch. The line was quiet for a moment. 28 days, Ray said. 28 days. "How much are we talking about?" She told him the number Gerald had implied, not stated directly but implied, and Ray made a sound that was not quite a word. "That's not nothing," he said. "No. But it's not impossible," he said. "Ray, it's not impossible, Claire. You know how many people in this community owe you? Not in a debt way, in a real way." His voice shifted. "You rebuilt Martinez's Sportster when he couldn't afford the parts, and you charged him $60 because that's what he had. You stayed at your shop until 2 in the morning, finishing Graves' Road King because she had a rally the next day and needed that bike. Do you understand how many people—" "I'm not asking people for money," Claire said. "I know you're not," Ray said. "I am." "Ray, Claire, let me." A pause. "This is what the community is for. You've spent 15 years being the community for everybody else. Let it work the other way for 10 minutes. She didn't answer right away. Outside, the Arizona night was pressing against the garage windows, and somewhere in the distance she could hear a lone engine. Someone on the highway moving through the dark at speed, going somewhere or coming from somewhere, the way people always were on that road. "There's something else," she said. "Tell me." "One of the boys called me today, Daniel Reeves, the one with the camera." Ray was quiet. "I told him to come to the shop tomorrow," she said. Another silence. "Claire Whitmore," Ray said. "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything bad. You were thinking it. I was thinking, he said slowly, that Rudy raised someone who scares me a little, in the best possible way. He paused. What are you going to do with him? I don't know yet, she said, but I think I'm going to find out. He showed up at 6:58. She saw the car pull up from the window. A 10-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked taillight. The kind of car that belongs to someone who is not yet making enough money to replace a cracked taillight, but is too responsible to ignore it entirely. Which told her something. He sat in the car for 4 minutes before he got out. She watched the clock while he sat there. 4 minutes. She'd had veterans sit in their cars outside her shop for longer than that. Grown men who had survived things that would fold most people in half, sitting outside a garage because walking through the door meant admitting something they weren't sure they were ready to admit. She understood the 4 minutes. When he came through the door, he was younger than she'd calculated from his voice. 20, maybe 21, tall, thin, the particular thinness of someone who hadn't finished filling out yet. He had his hands in the pockets of his jeans and his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone who is not sure whether they belong somewhere, but is trying very hard not to look like they're not sure. He looked at the shop, at the 2 bikes in various stages of disassembly, at the tools on the wall, at Claire standing at the workbench with a cup of coffee. You actually came, she said. You told me to, he said. Lots of people get told to do things they don't do. He said nothing. Coffee? She said. He blinked. Sure, yeah, thank you. She poured a second cup from the machine on the corner of the workbench and handed it to him. He took it with both hands, the way you take something when your hands are nervous and holding something gives them something to do. The other guys, he said, Marcus and Brett and Delacroix, do they know you called me? No, she said. Do you know I'm requesting that all 4 of you be assigned here as part of whatever the court orders? His eyes went slightly wide. No, he said. I didn't know that. Would that be a problem? I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was interesting. She'd expected either immediate agreement or immediate resistance, not actual consideration. Delacroix won't like it, he said. He doesn't. He's got a lot of pride. Most people who break things do, Claire said. Daniel looked at her. What does that mean? It means, she said, setting down her coffee, that people who feel powerless tend to do powerful things to make themselves feel otherwise. Breaking something that belongs to someone weaker than you feels like power. For about 30 seconds. And then, she gestured around the shop, and then there's all this, she said. All this work, waiting to be done, and you're still the same person who broke something. He was quiet. What do you want me to do? He said. Right now, I want you to hand me a 3/8 socket from that rack on the wall. She went back to the bike she was working on. And then I want you to watch what I do. And then, if you're still here in an hour, I'll start teaching you to do it yourself. He looked at the rack. He found the 3/8 socket. He handed it to her without dropping it. He was still there 3 hours later. What happened in that shop over the following days was not a transformation. Transformations are for movies, and this was not a movie. What happened was slower and more honest than that. It was a 21-year-old kid with greasy hands and a posture that gradually, incrementally, over the course of 4 days, changed from apologetic to present. It was Claire answering questions she hadn't expected to be asked. About the veterans she worked for, about what it cost to run a nonprofit restoration program, about why she'd stayed in Phoenix instead of going somewhere bigger, somewhere with more resources. It was Daniel Reeves on his 3rd day, stopping with a wrench in his hand and saying, the guy this bike belongs to, what happened to him? Claire looked up from the manifold she was working on. His name is Gus Ferraro, she said. IED in Kandahar province, 2011. Lost most of the function in his left hand. He rode before, did it for 20 years. When he came back, he thought he'd never ride again. She paused. I modified the controls so he can operate everything with his right hand. He's picking it up next Friday. Daniel stared at the bike. He's going to ride it, he said. He's going to ride it, Claire confirmed. Because of what you did. Because of what he did. Then she said, I just fixed the machine. He did the hard part. Daniel looked at the bike for a long time. I didn't know this kind of thing existed, he said. Most people don't, Claire said. That's part of the problem. That was the moment. She saw it happen. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where someone turns to the camera and announces their epiphany. It was quieter than that. His face just changed, very slightly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. And he went back to work with his hands moving differently than they had before. She didn't say anything about it. She just handed him a torque wrench and told him what to do next. The call from Ray came on the fourth day, while Daniel was in the shop and Claire was on the phone with the court liaison about the formal order for all 4 young men. "I need you to come to the rally Friday night," Ray said, "the one out at Saguaro Flats." "Ray, I need you to come," he said again, and something in his voice made her stop. "What did you do?" she said. "Nothing bad?" "Ray, I made some calls," he said. "I talked to some people who know other people who wanted to do something and didn't know there was something to do." "What does that mean in plain language?" "It means Friday night," he said. "Come to the rally. Bring the kid if you want." She looked at Daniel, who was bent over the Ferraro bike, trying to get a bolt in a place his fingers barely fit, muttering under his breath with the particular concentration of someone who has decided that the bolt is going to go in if it takes all afternoon. "He has a name," she said. "Daniel." "Bring Daniel," Ray said. "He should see this." "See what?" "What happens," Ray said, "when people find out what you actually do." She almost didn't go. There is a version of this story where Claire Whitmore stayed in the shop on Friday night and worked on the Harley and didn't go to the rally at Saguaro Flats. And that version is also a version of her, the one who preferred to work alone, who had always found it easier to give than to receive, who had inherited from her father not just the motorcycle but the stubborn self-sufficiency that had been both his greatest strength and the thing that had occasionally made his life lonelier than it needed to be. But she went, and when she walked into Saguaro Flats at 7:45 on Friday evening, with Daniel Reeves 2 steps behind her, looking like a man walking into something he has not fully prepared for, she understood immediately what Ray had done. There were riders there she recognized and riders she had never seen. There were people who had driven in from Tucson and Flagstaff and Yuma. There was a banner, hand-painted, a little uneven on the right side, that said Desert Freedom Stays. There was a woman from the VA office who Claire had worked with for 6 years, standing beside a man Claire recognized as a city council member she had met exactly once at a community meeting 2 years ago. There was Goose Ferraro, whose modified Harley was waiting in Claire's shop, standing with a coffee in his one fully functional hand and a look on his face that Claire couldn't quite read until he saw her across the crowd, and it became instantly readable. It was pride, not for himself, for her. Ray materialized from somewhere in the crowd, hands in pockets, white beard, the dark, warm eyes. "You came," he said. "You knew I would," she said. "I hoped," he corrected. She looked around at the crowd, at the banner, at the faces she knew and the faces she didn't. "Ray," she said, "what is this?" "This," he said, "is what happens when you've spent 15 years doing the work and someone finally tells the room." She opened her mouth. "Don't say it's too much," he said. She closed her mouth. "Don't say you don't need it." "Ray, Claire," he looked at her straight. "Rudy used to say the hardest thing for strong people is letting other people be strong for them." He paused. He said he had to learn it, said it took him too long. He looked at the crowd. "He'd want you to learn it faster." She didn't answer. Behind her, Daniel was very quiet. She'd half forgotten he was there until she heard him say softly, not to anyone in particular, "This is all because of her." Gus Ferraro, who had walked over while Ray was talking, heard him. He looked at Daniel, and there was a moment where something passed between them. The kid who had broken something without understanding what it was, and the man who understood better than most what it meant when something that carried your freedom was taken from you. "Son," Gus said, "you don't even know the half of it." And then he started talking. And the story of Claire Whitmore, not the parking lot version, not the Harley version, but the real story, the 15-year story, the one built in late nights and donated parts and modified hand controls and veterans who had given everything and come home to nothing and found something again in the simple act of being back on a road. That story began to fill the space between them. Daniel Reeves stood there and listened, and he didn't look away once. And Claire stood slightly to the side and listened to Gus tell her story back to her, and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't have named in the moment, and that she would spend several days trying to name afterward, and that eventually she would understand was the particular ache that comes from finally, after a very long time, being seen. Gus Ferraro talked for 22 minutes. Claire knew because she watched the clock on the wall behind him, not because she was impatient, but because she was trying to anchor herself to something concrete, while everything else in the room felt like it was moving just slightly faster than she could track. 22 minutes, and in that time, Gus covered things she had never told anyone. Not Ray, not Marcus, her young assistant, not the VA liaisons, or the city council people, or the journalists who had occasionally called about human interest stories and whom she had occasionally declined because she had never been comfortable with the idea of her work becoming a story someone else told. Gus told it anyway. He told it the way combat veterans tell things when they finally decide to tell them, with a flatness that makes the weight more visible, not less. He told Daniel about the morning he came back to Phoenix and sat in his kitchen for 4 hours without moving, because the silence of a kitchen that didn't have to be tactical was its own kind of terrifying. He told him about the first time he tried to grip a coffee mug with his left hand after the surgeries and how the mug fell and shattered on the tile, and how he sat on the kitchen floor and looked at the pieces and thought, with a clarity that scared him, that the mug was a better metaphor than he wanted it to be. He told him about calling Claire, not because he'd known her. He hadn't. He'd found Desert Freedom Garage through a flyer at the VA office, a plain white sheet of paper with a phone number and 6 words. "We help veterans get back in the road." I called and she answered, Gus said. Not a machine, not a receptionist, her. It was 7:30 in the morning. He looked at Claire. "You remember what you said?" "Tell me what you need," Claire said quietly. "Tell me what you need," Gus repeated to Daniel. That was it. First thing out of her mouth. Not what's wrong with you. Not what are your limitations. Not let me tell you what we can and can't do. Tell me what you need. He shook his head slowly. "You have any idea how long it had been since somebody asked me that?" Daniel said nothing. He had the look of someone who had stopped trying to figure out where to put their face. 8 months later, Gus said, "I've got a bike with controls I can actually use, and I'm going on the road for the first time in 4 years." He paused. "Because of her, because of that shop, because of a flyer on a wall in a VA office that she paid for out of her own pocket and put up herself." He looked directly at Daniel. "That's the shop you helped put in jeopardy. That's what was parked outside that diner." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't call for a response, because a response would be insufficient. Daniel seemed to understand that. He kept his mouth closed. His jaw worked slightly, like he was managing something internally. And then he looked at the ground, and then he looked up. And when he looked up, his eyes were red at the edges. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Claire watched him and thought about what Ray had said, that the hardest thing for strong people is letting other people be strong for them. She thought that maybe the same thing, slightly inverted, was true for people who had broken something. The hardest thing was not apologizing. The hardest thing was standing there while someone showed you the full weight of what you had broken without looking away. Daniel Reeves didn't look away. That told her something. She wasn't sure yet exactly what it told her, but it told her something. The rally moved around them. Riders talking, the city council member in conversation with 2 women Claire vaguely recognized from a veterans advocacy group in Tempe. Ray circulating through the crowd with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years being the person who connected people to other people. Someone started a collection. Not past hat informal, an actual organized collection with a folding table and a sign-in sheet and a QR code that one of the younger riders had set up on a phone, and people were lining up at it, and Claire watched this for 30 seconds before she turned to Ray, who had materialized at her shoulder. "I told you not to," she started. "You told me you weren't asking anyone for money," he said. "You're not." "I am. Different person, different ask." He held up one hand. "Before you say it, this is not charity. This is a community protecting something that belongs to it. Desert Freedom Garage doesn't belong to Gerald Fitch. It doesn't belong to you either, if we're being honest. It belongs to every person who ever walked through that door and left with something restored." She opened her mouth. "Rudy," he said. She closed it. "Your father sat in that garage and taught you that machines carry memories. You turned that into something you give to other people." He looked at the line at the folding table. "Those people want to protect what you built. Let them." She looked at the line. Gus Ferraro was already at the front of it, signing in with his right hand, the only hand that could sign reliably. He didn't look up from the paper, but the set of his shoulders said everything. Claire breathed in, she breathed out. Okay, she said. Yeah? Ray looked at her sideways. Don't make a thing of it, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else and went back to circulating. Claire stood there and watched people line up to protect something she had built, and the feeling in her chest was still the one she couldn't name, and it was bigger now, and it was getting harder to keep her face neutral about it. Behind her quietly, Daniel said, Can I sign in too? She turned and looked at him. I don't have a lot, he said quickly. I know it doesn't fix what I did, but if there's a line, I want to be in it. She looked at him for a moment. Get in line, she said. He went. She watched him walk to the back of the line, not cut to the front, not hover at the edges, just take his place at the back. And she thought that there are moments in the raising of a person, even if you're not the one who raised them, where you see the thing that was always in them start to find its way to the surface. And it is one of the more complicated kinds of hope, because you know it doesn't erase what came before, but you also know that it is real. It was real. That much she was sure of. No. What she was not sure of, driving home that night with the windows down and the desert air coming through the car, was whether real would be enough. 28 days had become 24. The rally had produced something. Ray called her the next morning with a number that was not the full amount, but was enough to make the conversation with Gerald Fitch worth having again. Enough to show him that this community took seriously what happened on Cochise Street. Enough, maybe, to buy time. But time for what? Exactly. She pulled into her garage and sat in the car for a moment in the dark, thinking about the things she had not told Ray. The things she had not told anyone yet, not even Marcus, who had been working in the shop with her for 3 years and knew her well enough to know when she was holding something back. 2 weeks before the parking lot, before Gerald Fitch's phone call, before any of this, she had received a letter from a woman named Sandra Kellerman, who worked for a nonprofit foundation in Washington, D.C. that provided funding for veteran support programs across the Southwest. The letter had said that Desert Freedom Garage had been nominated for a grant, a significant grant, the kind that would not only secure the shop's future for 3 years, but would allow expansion into 2 additional cities. The letter had also said that the decision would be made in 30 days from the date of the letter. The date of the letter was the same week as the parking lot. 28 days from that letter was in 2 days. 2 days. She had not responded to the letter, not because she'd missed it, because she'd been afraid of it. That was the honest truth, and honesty was the one thing Claire Whitmore had always been unable to argue herself out of. She had been afraid of it in the way that people who have built something entirely from their own hands are afraid of someone else's assessment of its value. The terror of being told by a stranger with a checklist that what you have created is or is not enough. She had set it aside. And then the parking lot happened, and Gerald Fitch called, and the letter sat in the drawer of her workbench like an unexploded thing. She went inside the house and got the letter out of the drawer where she'd been keeping it. Not the workbench drawer. She'd moved it after the parking lot, brought it inside, put it in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus, like hiding it in the ordinary would diffuse whatever power it had. She sat at the kitchen table with it. She read it again. Sandra Kellerman, Foundation for American Veterans Independence. Grant amount that made her close her eyes for a moment. Application requirements. References. Program documentation. A site visit, if invited to the second round. A deadline, 48 hours. She sat there for a long time. The house was quiet the way desert houses are quiet late at night. Not silent, but a kind of contained, particular quiet that has its own texture. She could hear the refrigerator. She could hear the occasional car on the road outside. She could hear from somewhere in the back of her own memory, her father's voice. A motorcycle is not made of metal. It carries someone's memories. She got a pen. She started writing. She was still at the table at 3 a.m. when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she now recognized. Daniel Reeves, this is going to sound strange, but I couldn't sleep. I told my uncle about your program tonight. He started crying. He didn't explain why. I think I understand now, though. She read it twice, then she typed back, get some sleep, 7 o'clock comes early. 3 dots appeared on the screen. Then, are you still coming in tomorrow? She looked at the application in front of her, at the 3 pages she'd already filled in, at the section she was halfway through about program outcomes and veteran participant, demographics, and the specific modifications she'd developed for single-hand operation of Harley-Davidson control systems. Modifications that didn't exist in any manufacturer's manual because she had invented them herself over 2 years of trial and error in the shop. She typed back, 7 o'clock, don't be late. Then she turned back to the application, and she wrote until the first gray light started at the edges of the windows. And when she was finished, she read the whole thing from the beginning, corrected 4 things, and at 6:45 in the morning, she submitted it. She sat there for a moment after she hit send, feeling the strange particular emptiness of having done something irreversible. And then she got up, made coffee, and drove to the shop. Daniel's Civic was already in the lot. 6:53. She had a feeling about this kid. She wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but she had it. The court order came through on a Tuesday. Deputy Torres called her himself, which she hadn't expected. Judge Arena signed it this morning, he said. Community service assignment, all 4 defendants. 200 hours each, assigned to Desert Freedom Garage under your supervision. Starting next Monday. All 4, she said, all 4, including Delacroix. She'd been expecting that to be the complication. Delacroix, whose full name she now knew was Brandon Delacroix, 23 years old, 1 prior for disorderly conduct, worked at his father's landscaping company in Gilbert, had, according to Daniel, pushed back hard against the idea of the assignment, had told the others it was humiliating, had suggested various alternatives, all of which involved less direct confrontation with the consequences of what he'd done. The judge had not been moved by Brandon Delacroix's suggestions. He's going to be difficult, Claire told Torres. Probably, Torres said, but here's the thing, Ms. Whitmore. Difficult people who are made to sit still with something long enough sometimes stop being difficult about it. He paused. I've been a deputy for 18 years. I've seen it. And when they don't, she said, then they violate the terms, it comes back to court, and the next option is less comfortable than sweeping floors in a motorcycle shop. He paused again. I don't think Delacroix is stupid. He made a stupid choice. Those are different things. I know they are, she said. Judge Arenas added one other thing, Torres said. He wants a progress report from you at 60 days, not from a probation officer, from you specifically. He said, and I'm reading directly here, Ms. Whitmore's approach to this matter demonstrates a quality of judgment this court wishes to encourage, and I am interested in what she observes. Claire didn't say anything for word, Torres said. She put the phone down after the call and stood at the workbench and thought about a federal judge in Arizona using the word encourage about something she'd done. She thought about how strange it was that a night in a parking lot, a broken mirror, a scratched tank, 4 drunk kids with a camera, had somehow become this. 51 motorcycles, a rally, a collection table, a grant application at 3 in the morning, a court order, a judge watching. Her father would have laughed. Not unkindly, the way he laughed when something was both absurd and exactly right. She thought, okay, Dad. She thought, okay. She called Ray. They're all coming Monday, she said, including Delacroix. Including Delacroix, a pause. You need me there? No, she said, but I want you nearby. Define nearby. If I call you, I want you here in 20 minutes. I'll be in 15, he said. Oh, wow. Monday came the way difficult things come. Exactly on schedule, without the decency to be delayed. Daniel arrived at 6:55, because Daniel now arrived at 6:55 every day without being told to, which was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. Marcus, her regular assistant, arrived at 7 sharp and took one look at Claire's face and said, how bad is today going to be? I don't know, she said. Scale of 1 to the time we had that carburetor fire? Carburetor fire was manageable, she said. We had tools for that. Marcus looked at her. What do you have for today? Time, she said, and coffee. That's your plan? Time and coffee? That's always been the plan, she said. It's worked so far. The other 3 arrived together, which told her something. They'd coordinated, which meant they'd been in communication, which meant there was some kind of consensus already forming between them about how to approach this. The one named Brett, quiet, 21, had barely spoken in the parking lot, came through the door first. Then the shortest one, whose name was Carlos, and who had been the one who sat down on the parking lot asphalt when the motorcycles arrived. Then, last, hands in pockets and jaw set at an angle that communicated everything without communicating anything specific, Brandon Delacroix. He looked at the shop. He looked at the bikes in various stages of disassembly. He looked at Claire. "So what?" he said. "We're fixing motorcycles." "Some days," Claire said. "Other days you'll be filing paperwork, sourcing parts, talking to veterans, cleaning this floor, and whatever else needs doing." She handed him a broom. "Today, this floor needs doing." He looked at the broom. "I'm not—" "Brandon," she said. He stopped. "I know you don't want to be here," she said. "I'm not asking you to want to be here. I'm asking you to be here. Those are different things." She held the broom out another inch. "The floor needs sweeping. You're one of the people in this building. The floor is your responsibility today." Something moved behind his eyes. Pride looking for a fight and not quite finding the right angle for one. She'd seen it before, not in men this young, but she'd seen the shape of it. The pride that comes from having never been asked to do something it considered beneath itself. He took the broom. He didn't say anything. She turned back to the Ferraro bike. Behind her, she heard the broom start moving. Across the shop, she caught Daniel watching Delacroix with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between relief and a kind of careful sympathy that looked hard-earned for someone his age. "Good," she thought. "That's good." Carlos was already at the parts rack, looking at everything with the focused curiosity of someone who finds new environments genuinely interesting. She'd noticed that at the rally. He'd been quiet but watchful, taking things in. She filed that away. Brett was standing near the Harley. Her father's Harley, still under the tarp, still waiting, still the thing she was not yet ready to begin on officially, because beginning it officially meant assessing it fully, and assessing it fully meant quantifying every inch of the damage in a way that she admitted to herself, not quite ready to do. "Is that it?" Brett said. She looked up. "Is that what?" "The bike from the parking lot? Is that the one under the tarp?" The shop got slightly quieter. Not silent. The broom kept moving. Marcus was doing something with an air compressor in the back, but quieter in the way a room gets when everyone in it has been waiting for a particular moment and the moment arrives. "Yes," Claire said. Brett looked at the tarp for a long moment. "Can I see it?" he said. She put down the wrench. She crossed the shop. She pulled the tarp back. The damage looked worse under the shop lights than it had in the parking lot at night, which was true of most things but felt particularly unkind here. The scratch on the tank caught the light and turned into a wound. The broken mirror bracket stuck out at the wrong angle with the particular wrongness of things that have been forced past what they were built to endure. Nobody said anything. Then Delacroix stopped sweeping. He stood there looking at the bike, and his jaw was doing the same thing Daniels had done at the rally, working something through that his face wasn't sure how to display. "That's bad," he said quietly, genuinely. "Yes," Claire said. "How long to fix it?" "Weeks," she said. "Maybe longer depending on parts. The leather on the seat is original. 40 years old. I have to find someone who can work with it without replacing it, because replacing it means losing what's in it." "What's in it?" Carlos said. She looked at him. He was 20 maybe, young enough that the question was completely genuine, without any layer of irony or deflection. "My father's hands," she said. "He restitched that seat himself. Every stitch is his." She looked at the seat. "If I replace it, it's just leather. If I repair it, it's still his." The shop was very quiet. Brett said very quietly, "I'm sorry." Not to the room, to the bike. Claire heard it, and it landed differently than she expected. Not as inadequate, which is how apologies to objects usually land, but as genuine, which is rarer and more valuable and harder to dismiss. "I know," she said. The grant letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not an email, an actual letter, which she noticed because everything official in her life arrived by email, and the sight of a real envelope on her shop floor, where it had come through the mail slot, struck her as deliberate, the way things done in old forms sometimes are. Sandra Kellerman, Foundation for American Veterans Independence. She held it for a moment without opening it. Marcus came out of the back and saw her standing there. "What's that?" he said. "Possibly everything," she said. "Possibly nothing." "Open it." "I'm getting there." "Claire." "Marcus." You've been standing there for 30 seconds. I'm aware. She opened the envelope. She read the first paragraph. She read it again. She set the letter down on the workbench. She picked up her coffee cup, put it down again. Well, Marcus said. She looked at him. Second round, she said. We made the second round. Marcus made a sound that was a genuine exclamation of something, and then he caught himself and stood up a little straighter the way he did when he was trying to be professional, which only made him look more excited. What does that mean? It means they want a site visit. Someone from the foundation comes here, looks at the operation, talks to program participants. She looked around the shop. Talks to the veterans we work with. When? She looked at the letter. 3 weeks, she said. She looked at the 4 young men who were currently doing various assigned tasks around the shop. Daniel working on a brake cable, Carlos sorting a parts bin, Brett carefully cleaning corrosion off a battery terminal with the slow focus of someone who has decided to do a small thing correctly, and Delacroix, who had stopped fighting the broom on day 2 and started asking questions on day 3, and had been caught on day 4 explaining to Carlos how the hydraulic clutch system worked, incorrectly but with great confidence, which was, Claire thought, its own kind of progress. 3 weeks. She thought about what a foundation site visitor would see walking into the shop in 3 weeks. She thought about what story this place told if you walked into it with fresh eyes. She thought about the tarp over her father's Harley, and the scratch on the tank, and the veterans whose bikes were lined up in various stages of completion, and the 4 young men who had destroyed something and were now slowly, imperfectly, learning how to build. She thought about her father's voice. A motorcycle is not made of metal. It carries someone's memories. She thought, this whole shop carries someone's memories. She thought, maybe that's the story. She picked up the phone. She called Ray. 3 weeks, she said when he answered. I need you to help me get Gus and 2 other program vets to come in and talk to someone. Talk to who? Ray said. A foundation visitor, someone who decides whether we get enough money to stay open and expand. A pause. Claire Whitmore, Ray said, you submitted the grant. I did. At 3 a.m. How did you? Because I know you, he said. I know exactly when you do brave things. It's always when nobody's watching. His voice was warm, warmer than the desert night that had started all of this. 3 weeks. Done. Who else do you need? She looked at the shop again, at Daniel, bent over the brake cable, at Delacroix, who was now sweeping his section of floor he had already swept twice, apparently because he needed something to do with his hands, while he thought. I might need them too, she said quietly. The boys? The boys, she said. Ray was quiet for a moment. You're going to use the people who broke the bike to help save the shop, he said slowly. I'm going to let the people who broke something show what happens when you learn to fix it, she said. Those are different things. Ray made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, but was, she had come to understand, his version of being moved. 3 weeks, he said. I'll be ready. She hung up. Across the shop, Daniel looked up from the brake cable. Everything okay, he said. She picked up her wrench. It will be, she said. She went back to work, and the shop moved around her. The sound of tools, the smell of grease and metal and old leather, the low hum of 4 young men learning the weight of what they had broken, and somewhere under the tarp in the corner, waiting with the patience of something that carries more than metal, her father's Harley Road King, holding everything it had always held, waiting for the hands that would make it whole again. The site visit was scheduled for a Thursday. Sandra Kellerman called the Monday before to confirm, not an email, a phone call, which Claire noted with the same attention she'd given the physical letter. People who still used the phone for things that didn't require the phone were people who understood that some communications needed a voice behind them. She had liked Sandra Kellerman before she'd ever spoken to her. After the call, she liked her more. I want to be transparent with you, Sandra had said, after the pleasantries. You are one of 3 programs in the final consideration round. The foundation funds 1 program per cycle in the Southwest region. The decision will be made within 10 days of the site visit. I understand, Claire said. I've read your application 3 times, Sandra said. The modifications you developed for single-hand operation, I've never seen anything like them in any program documentation I've reviewed. Did you work with an engineer on those? No, Claire said, a pause. You developed them yourself? Over about 2 years, Claire said. A lot of failed attempts first. Another pause, longer. Ms. Whitmore, can I ask you something personal? You can ask, Claire said. Why haven't you patented those modifications or documented them in any formal way that other programs could access? Claire thought about that for a moment. It wasn't the first time she'd been asked. Marcus had raised it twice. Ray had raised it once, clumsily, in the way Ray raised things he thought were important but wasn't sure how to approach. Because a patent means paperwork and lawyers, she said. And every dollar I've spent on paperwork and lawyers is a dollar I didn't spend on parts. She paused. And because the modifications don't work the same way twice, every veteran is different, every injury is different. The ones I did for Gus Ferraro won't work the same way for someone with a different injury pattern. What I have isn't a formula, it's a method, and methods belong to the people who need them. Sandra Kellerman was quiet for a moment. Thursday, she said, 10 o'clock. I'm looking forward to meeting you. After she hung up, Claire stood in the shop and told herself she was not nervous. She was absolutely nervous. The 3 days between the phone call and the Thursday visit were the most concentrated work she could remember doing in years, and she had spent years doing concentrated work. Not nervous preparation work. She refused to perform for a site visit, refused to stage the shop into something it wasn't, because if the foundation funded a performance, they'd be funding the wrong thing. She worked on Gus Ferraro's bike and got it to within 2 days of completion. She worked on a Sportster belonging to a veteran named Lena Chu who had lost 3 fingers on her right hand to a training accident and needed left side control modifications. She filed the 60-day report for Judge Arenas, which she had been putting off because writing about the 4 young men required being honest about what she observed, and what she observed was complicated in ways that a court document didn't naturally accommodate. She wrote it anyway, honestly. She wrote that Daniel Reeves had stopped needing to be told what to do in the mornings and had started making a list of tasks the night before. She wrote that Carlos had an instinctive mechanical aptitude that surprised her and that she had begun giving him progressively more complex tasks to see where his ceiling was. She wrote that Brett was quiet but precise, the kind of person who reads the instruction once and follows it exactly, and that this quality, which can be mistaken for passivity, was in practice one of the most valuable things in a shop. She wrote that Brandon Delacroix was the most difficult and the most interesting, and that those 2 things were connected in a way she was still working out. She wrote, I is a person who learned at some point that the world was divided into the powerful and the powerless, and that being on the wrong side of that line was intolerable. He has spent years performing power. What he has never been taught is that real power is generative. It makes things, it builds things, it repairs things. The first time he successfully adjusted a carburetor without being shown twice, he looked at it for a long moment and didn't say anything. But something changed in his posture. I have seen that change before, in veterans who make it through a first solo ride after injury. It is the specific shift that comes from discovering that your hands can make something work. She sent it to the court liaison and then sat there for a moment because she had just described Brandon Delacroix's potential to a federal court, and she was not entirely sure what that made her feel. Complicated, she thought. It made her feel complicated. She was good with complicated. She'd been working with complicated things her whole life. Motorcycles were complicated. People were more complicated. The trick was the same: patience, the right tools, and the willingness to start where the damage was instead of where you wished it were. Wednesday night, the night before the site visit, Delacroix asked to speak with her alone. The others had left at 5. Marcus had locked up the back. Claire was at the workbench, sorting through a parts order, when Delacroix came back through the front door. He'd walked out with the others. She'd heard the Civic pull out of the lot, and then 10 minutes later the door opened again, and there he was. She looked up. Forget something? She said. No. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, which was his default position when he was about to say something he hadn't rehearsed. I wanted to talk to you. She set down the parts list. Okay. He came to the workbench and stood across from her, and she waited because she had learned in 3 weeks that Brandon Delacroix needed a beat before he could get to anything real. He had spent so long performing confidence that the machinery of it ran ahead of him, even when he was trying to say something genuine. Tomorrow, he said finally, the foundation visit. What about it? Do you want us there? Me specifically? She looked at him. Why wouldn't I? Because, he said and stopped. Started again. Because I'm the reason any of this is a story. I'm the reason the parking lot happened. I pushed. He stopped again. I'm the one who said it was a good idea. The others followed because I was the one with the camera and the mouth, and because I made it sound like it was nothing. He looked at the tarp over her father's Harley. It wasn't nothing. No, Claire said, it wasn't. I'm saying, he said, that if having me there tomorrow makes it harder for you to get what you need, I'll stay away. Tell the foundation I couldn't make it. Whatever you need. She studied him. This was the thing about Delacroix. He was infuriating, and he was also, underneath all the performance, not entirely what she had first taken him for. The performance was real. The pride was real, but there was something else in there that the performance had been covering. And 3 weeks of sweeping floors and sorting parts and watching veterans come through the door had been very gradually uncovering it. Why did you come back? She said. He blinked. What? After you left tonight, you came back. He was quiet. Because I've been thinking about the bike, he said, about what you said, about it carrying your father's memories. He looked at the tarp again. I've been thinking about that every day. I can't stop thinking about it. Good, she said. He looked at her sharply. Good? Yes, she said. That's what accountability feels like when it's working. It doesn't go away, it just changes shape. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to fix it, he said. I know technically we're going to fix the bike, but I don't know how to fix the actual thing. The thing it means. She looked at him for a long moment. Brandon, she said, you can't fix the thing it means. What you broke is already broken. The bike can be restored, but the fact that you were the one who scratched it, that's permanent. She let that land. What you can do is decide what you build from here. That's the only part that's still in play. His jaw worked. That's not very satisfying, he said. No, she agreed, it's not. Is it enough? She thought about her father sitting in a garage with his hand on a Harley Road King that carried 30 years of miles inside it. She thought about coming home from a military career with a shoulder that didn't work right and going into a garage and rebuilding 3 motorcycles in 4 months because the work was the answer even when the answer wasn't satisfying. It has to be, she said, because it's the only thing on offer. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, with the particular decisiveness of someone who has closed a door inside themselves that needed closing. I'll be here at 7, he said. 6:55, she said. Daniel gets here at 6:55. I don't want him thinking he's the most punctual. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was almost a smile. Not quite, but almost. He left. She stood alone in the shop and thought about what she had just said. That what was broken was permanently broken. That you couldn't fix the meaning of damage, only build from its aftermath. And she thought about how true that was and how hard it was to believe when you were the one with something broken. And she thought about her father's Harley under the tarp and the scratch that the shop light turned into a wound. Then she pulled the tarp back. She looked at the bike for a long time. She picked up her phone and called Ray. It's late, he said, but without complaint, because Ray had never in 40 years of knowing Claire's family complained about late calls. I need to start on the Harleys, she said. Tonight? No, after the visit. After we know. She paused. I want you there when I start. I want someone who knew him there when I take the first piece off. Ray didn't answer immediately. She could hear him breathing, the way you can hear someone managing something on the other end of a line. I'll be there, he said. Whenever it happens, she said. Whenever I'm ready. I'll be there, he said again. No matter when. She covered the Harley back up. She turned off the shop light. She went home. Thursday arrived cold for October in Arizona, which meant it was 62 degrees instead of 80, and the light came in at an angle that made the shop look different from the way it looked in summer. Sharper, somehow more defined, the kind of light that shows you exactly what things are. Sandra Kellerman arrived at 9:58. Claire had expected someone who looked like a foundation, conservative, careful, clipboard energy. Sandra Kellerman was 61 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and boots that had seen actual use and a handshake that meant something. Thank you for having me, she said. Thank you for coming out, Claire said. Sandra looked around the shop, not the sweep of someone cataloging, the look of someone seeing. There was a difference. Claire had learned to tell them apart in the first seconds. It smells like my grandfather's garage, Sandra said. Most good garages smell the same, Claire said. Sandra smiled. He was a Korean war vet, spent every Saturday in their room. She was still looking around. Never talked about the war, only talked in the garage. She turned back to Claire. I think I understand your program better already. Claire introduced Marcus, who was professional and warm in the way Marcus always was, which she appreciated because she was not always either of those things simultaneously. She introduced Daniel, who shook Sandra's hand and said, "Nice to meet you," without any of the awkwardness she might have expected from him 3 weeks ago. She introduced Carlos and Brett. She introduced Delacroix, who had arrived at 6:54, 1 minute before Daniel, which Claire noted and chose not to comment on, and who shook Sandra's hand and said his name clearly and made eye contact. Small things, but nothing was a small thing when you were paying attention. She did not immediately explain who the 4 young men were. She let the morning do that. Gus Ferraro arrived at 10:30 as planned. He came through the door on his own 2 feet, which didn't sound like a significant thing until you understood that 6 months ago he had come through this same door for the first time walking with a cane. He was clearly furious about needing, and a look on his face that said he had come here because he was out of other options, not because he believed this would work. He came in without the cane. Gus, Claire said, this is Sandra Kellerman. She's from the foundation I told you about. Gus looked at Sandra with the specific evaluating look of a man who has spent enough of his life being assessed by people with clipboards that he has developed a strong preference for people without them. Sandra didn't have a clipboard. What branch? Gus said. Sandra blinked. I'm sorry? Military. What branch? Oh, none, actually. My father was Army. My brother was Marine Corps. Gus nodded slowly. What happened to your brother? He came home, Sandra said. But not entirely. Something shifted in Gus's face. The evaluating look didn't disappear, but it changed quality, became something less defensive and more direct. Then you know why this matters, he said. Yes, Sandra said. I do. Gus looked at Claire. Something passed between them. The specific communication of 2 people who have spent enough time in the same work to share a shorthand. Tell her about the hand controls, Claire said. Gus looked at his left hand. He held it up. The one with the limited function, the one that had dropped the coffee mug on the kitchen floor and sent him to the kitchen tiles and very nearly to somewhere he didn't come back from, metaphorically speaking. She built me something that doesn't exist anywhere else, he said to Sandra. There's no manual for it, no manufacturer option. She figured it out herself, made it twice before she got it right, and charged me for parts only. He lowered his hand. I'm picking up my bike on Friday. First time on a road in 4 years. Sandra wrote something in the small notebook she'd had in her jacket pocket. Do you mind if I ask how the injury affected your daily life before the program? Gus looked at her for a moment. You want the real answer or the polished one? He said. Real, Sandra said. I stopped going outside, he said. That's the short version. I could manage inside. Inside had things I could control. Outside had everything I'd lost control of. And it was all right there, and I couldn't. He stopped. The motorcycle was never just transportation for me. It was the way I moved through the world on my own terms. When I lost the hand function, I thought that was over. He looked at Claire. She told me on the first call, tell me what you need, not what can you do, not what's possible, not what the manufacturer recommends. What do you need? He looked back at Sandra. I told her, and she built it. Sandra stopped writing. She looked at Claire. Claire looked at the work order she was pretending to review. How many veterans have come through this program? Sandra said to Claire directly. Formally enrolled, with completed restorations or modifications, 47, Claire said. Currently active, meaning bikes in progress, 9. And you run this alone? With Marcus, she said, and currently with some additional help. She hesitated for just a moment. Then she said, Sandra, can I tell you something about the 4 young men you met this morning? Sandra looked at her. She told her. Not the parking lot version. She'd told that story enough times now that she could hear when it was becoming a performance of itself, and she refused to let it. She told the real version, the one that included her own fear the night of the parking lot, which she hadn't admitted to anyone except the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning. She told the version that included her father's voice in the grant application written by hand at 3 in the morning and Delacroix coming back through the door on Wednesday night to ask whether his presence would hurt her chances. Sandra listened without writing anything. When Claire finished, Sandra looked across the shop to where Delacroix was working with Daniel on the brake system of Lena Chu's Sportster. They were arguing quietly about something, Daniel pointing at the left grip assembly, Delacroix shaking his head, the specific disagreement of two people who both think they know how something works. "Which one is Delacroix?" Sandra said. "The one who thinks Daniel is wrong," Claire said. "Is Daniel wrong?" Claire looked. "About this particular brake assembly, yes," she said. "But he'll figure it out." Sandra watched them for a moment. "How did you get from the parking lot to this?" she said. Not critically, with genuine curiosity. "My father used to say, you can't fix the meaning of damage," Claire said. "You can only build from where it leaves you." Sandra wrote that down. The visit lasted 3 hours. Sandra spoke to Marcus for 20 minutes about operational logistics and sourcing, which Marcus handled with his characteristic mix of competence and enthusiasm that made him the best possible person to talk to about things Claire found tedious. She spoke to Lena Chu, who had arrived mid-morning not for her bike. It wasn't ready yet. But because Claire had called and asked if she'd come, and Lena Chu was the kind of person who showed up when asked because she knew what it meant to need people to show up. Lena was 44, compact, with the direct eye contact of someone who had learned that hesitancy costs more than it saves. She had been a logistics officer. She talked about her injury with the flatness that Gus used. The flatness that wasn't emotional distance, but was something more like emotional precision. "I was told by 3 separate professionals that I would not ride again," she said to Sandra. "I was told it matter-of-factly, like it was a logistical assessment. Here are your limitations. Adjust accordingly." She looked at her right hand, at the space where her 3 fingers were absent. "Nobody asked me what the motorcycle meant to me. Nobody asked what I would lose if I stopped." She paused. Claire asked. "What did you tell her?" Sandra said. "I told her it was the only time I felt completely like myself," Lena said. "On the road, just the machine and the road, and every decision mine to make." She looked at Claire. She understood that without explanation. "Why?" Sandra said. "Because she's a rider," Lena said. She didn't grow up being told motorcycles were too dangerous for women. Her father taught her before she had a chance to absorb that message. So she doesn't see the limitation first. She sees the rider. Sandra looked at Claire. Claire looked at the Sportster. 2 more days on the controls, she said to no one in particular. The moment that broke something open happened at 11:47, and it happened because of Brandon Delacroix, and it happened completely without Claire's planning. Sandra had moved to the corner of the shop where the Harley sat under its tarp, because she was the kind of visitor who looked at everything, and the tarp was conspicuous in the way covered things always are. She had not asked about it. She was standing near it, not touching it, just being near it, the way people stand near things they sense are significant. Delacroix noticed. He had been across the shop, hands on the Sportster, and he looked up and saw Sandra standing near the tarp, and he put the wrench down and walked over. Claire watched this happen and said nothing. Delacroix stood beside Sandra and said, "That's her dad's bike." Sandra looked at him. "We broke it," he said, "me and the others, in that parking lot." He said it completely level, without the defensive edge that had been in his voice the first 2 weeks, without the performance that came before it. Just a fact, stated by the person responsible for the fact. Sandra looked at the tarp. "What was it like," Sandra said carefully, "when you realized what you'd done?" Delacroix was quiet for a moment. "I didn't realize it that night," he said. "That's the honest answer. That night I thought we'd scratched a bike." He paused. "I started realizing it when I met Gus. When he talked about the machine being the way he moved through the world on his own terms." He looked at the tarp. "And then I started thinking about Claire's father sitting in his garage and teaching her mechanics, and how every imperfection on that bike was from a ride he took, a place he went, something he lived through." He stopped. "And we just scratched through all of it, with a key, for nothing." The shop was very quiet. "For nothing," he said again. Not dramatically, with the particular weight of someone who has finished a calculation and doesn't like the answer. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do about that?" she said. "Work," he said, "until the bike is fixed, and then keep working." He looked at Claire across the shop. She said you can't fix the meaning of what's broken. You can only build from where it leaves you. Sandra turned to look at Claire. Claire was looking at the torque wrench in her hand. I'll help restore it, Delacroix said. If she'll let me, I want to be one of the people who puts it back. He set it to the tarp, to the bike, to whatever he believed was inside it. I can't undo the scratch, but I can be part of what comes after it. Nobody said anything. Then Gus Ferraro, who had been sitting in the shop's one chair drinking his third coffee, said from across the room, Son, that's the most useful thing any person can say. Sandra left at 1:15. She shook Claire's hand at the door and said, 10 days. You'll hear from us. I understand, Claire said. Miss Whitmore, Sandra said, and she stopped, and there was something in her face that was not foundation. Visitor professional, but was something more like what Gus had seen in his brother's face. Not entirely back, but present in a way that mattered. What you've built here is not a program. It's an argument. Claire looked at her. For what? That people can be restored, Sandra said. Not just motorcycles. She left. Claire stood in his doorway and watched her rental car pull out of the lot and then stood there a moment longer. In the October light that came in sharp and clear and showed everything exactly as it was. Marcus appeared behind her. Well, he said. 10 days, she said. Is that good? I don't know, she said, but it's what we have. She turned back into the shop. The four young men were still at their stations. Daniel had been right about the brake assembly. He'd figured it out in the last 20 minutes of the visit, quietly without announcing it, just fixed the problem and moved on. Delacroix was back at the Sportster. Carlos was inventorying parts with the focused quiet that she'd come to recognize as his version of being completely absorbed. Brett was doing something careful to a carburetor with the same slow precision he brought to every task. She looked at all of them. She thought about what Sandra had said, that the shop was an argument that people could be restored. She thought about her father and his hand flat against the tank of the Road King, saying every mile I ever rode, every time I didn't give up. She thought, this shop is the same thing. Every bike in here carries someone something. Every person who walks through that door is carrying something. The work is just making room for it. She picked up a wrench. She went back to work. At 4:30, Ray called. How'd it go, he said. I don't know yet, she said. Give me more than that. She thought about Gus talking about tell me what you need. She thought about Lena Chu and the missing fingers, and she seized the rider. She thought about Delacroix standing at the tarp saying I can't undo the scratch, but I can be part of what comes after. I think it went like us, she said. What does that mean? Complicated, she said. Real and not finished. Ray made the sound, not a laugh, not anything, but itself recognizable and warm. When are you starting on Rudy's bike, he said. She looked at the tarp. 10 days, Sandra had said. You'll hear from us. Soon, Claire said, when the time is right. You'll know, Ray said. I'll know, she agreed. She hung up and looked at the covered Harley for a long moment, and then she looked away, and she kept working because the work was always the answer. And tomorrow Gus Ferraro was picking up his bike, and that was enough to make tomorrow worth getting to. Gus Ferraro picked up his bike on a Friday morning at 8 o'clock, and he didn't cry until he was already sitting on it. Claire had expected some kind of moment. She had seen enough of these handovers to know that they had their own shape, their own particular emotional architecture. The way funerals have a shape or weddings have a shape, the ceremony of the thing building to something that needed releasing. What she had not expected was that Gus would hold it together through the whole walkthrough, the explanation of the modified controls, the test of every function, the final check of the hand grip she'd rebuilt 4 times before it felt right, and then sit down on the seat, put both hands on the bars, and just stop. He sat there with his hands on the bars and his jaw working and his eyes on the middle distance in front of him. And the shop was completely quiet because Marcus had somehow understood that it needed to be quiet, and Daniel had understood. And even Delacroix, who had not yet learned to read every room but was getting better at it, had put down whatever he was holding and gone still. Gus didn't make a sound. His shoulders moved once. Just once. Then he breathed in hard through his nose and said to the handlebars, 4 years. Nobody answered. 4 years, he said again. And then he looked up and his eyes were red and he looked at Claire and said, tell me what I owe you. Parts cost, Claire said. Same as always. Claire, Gus. That's not Gus. She held his gaze. Get on the road. Come back and tell me how it felt. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, one slow, definitive nod that said everything the conversation had circled without landing on. And he started the engine. The sound filled the shop like something returning to where it had always belonged. Daniel was standing beside Claire when Gus pulled out. She heard the kid exhale beside her, slow and long, the exhalation of someone who had been holding something and didn't realize it until they let it go. That's what this is for, Daniel said. Not a question, a recognition. That's what this is for, Claire confirmed. She went back inside. She had work to do, but she stood at the workbench for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, the way her father used to stand with his hand on the tank of the Road King. And she felt the vibration of Gus's engine through the ground for just a few seconds more until the road took him. Then it was quiet, and she picked up her tools. The 10 days Sandra Kellerman had promised became 11, then 12, and on the 13th day, Claire stopped checking her phone with the focused attention she'd been giving it and started checking it with the distracted resignation of someone who has decided that whatever happens will happen at a time that is not convenient, which is when most important things happen. She had other things to focus on anyway. Lena Chu's Sportster was finished on day 8, and Lena had come in with a friend, another veteran named Patricia, who wore her service on her face in the way some people do, not as a wound but as a permanent adjustment, like someone who has recalibrated their center of gravity and walks differently because of it. Patricia watched Lena go through the controls and said nothing for a longer time and then said to Claire quietly, "Do you take women?" "The program takes veterans," Claire said. "What do you ride?" And that was the beginning of intake number 48. Gerald Fitch called on day 10 to ask whether she had any update on her situation. The question had a particular quality, not cold but careful, the careful of a man who is genuinely torn and is trying to determine which side of the tear he'll end up on before someone decides for him. "Not yet," Claire said. "The development company is pushing for an answer," he said. "I understand," she said. "Claire, Gerald, I am not asking you to lose money for me. I'm asking you for time." A pause. "How much time?" "A few more days," she said. Another pause. Longer. "I'll tell them I need to review the contract language," he said. "That buys a week." "Thank you, Gerald." "Don't thank me yet," he said. But his voice had something in it that was not quite resolution, but was moving toward it. She hung up and told Marcus. "A week," Marcus said. "A week," she confirmed. "That's enough?" "It has to be," she said. "Well." The call from Sandra Kellerman came on day 13 at 2:17 in the afternoon. Claire was elbow deep in a primary chain case and her phone was on the workbench 3 feet away, and she heard it ring and looked at the number and felt something drop through her stomach in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the recognition that this was the moment. Not a moment leading to the moment, not another step, but the actual thing. She wiped her hands on the shop rag. She picked up the phone. "Sandra," she said. "Claire." A pause, just a half second. The pause of someone who knows they are carrying something significant and is taking the weight of it seriously. "I'm calling with the Foundation's decision." The shop was not quiet. Marcus was running an air wrench in the back. Daniel and Delacroix were arguing again about something she couldn't hear clearly. Carlos was moving parts around the shelf with his characteristic methodical sound. All of it continued, oblivious, while Claire stood at the workbench and held the phone against her ear and waited. "The board met yesterday," Sandra said. "It was not a quick meeting." "Okay," Claire said. "There were 2 other programs in consideration," Sandra said. "Both excellent, both with strong track records and solid operational structures." Claire said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that the people who fill silence with reassurance are usually the ones about to deliver bad news. And Sandra Kellerman was not filling the silence, which was either a very good sign or the kind of composure that comes from having delivered both kinds of news and knowing that neither deserves drama. "The board voted to fund Desert Freedom Garage," Sandra said. The air wrench stopped, not because Marcus had heard anything, just because it did. In the sudden quiet, Sandra said, "Full grant amount, 3-year commitment with the expansion option to 2 additional cities at the 18-month mark, contingent on operational benchmarks that I believe. Based on what I saw Thursday, You will not have trouble meeting. Claire put her free hand flat on the workbench. She was not going to be dramatic about this. She was absolutely being dramatic about this internally in the place where she kept the things she didn't perform. Claire, Sandra said. I'm here, Claire said. She stopped, started again. Thank you. Don't thank me, Sandra said. I want to tell you what pushed the decision. The board viewed the site visit notes, the application documentation, the testimonials from Gus Ferraro and Lena Chu that I included in my report. She paused. And I included something else. I included what Brandon Delacroix said at the TARP. Claire was very still. I wrote it down verbatim, Sandra said. Word for word. I can't undo the scratch, but I can be part of what comes after. A pause. One of the board members, a retired Marine colonel who has been on this foundation for 9 years, read that and said, and I'm quoting him directly, fund it. This is the whole argument for everything we do, right here. Claire looked at the tarp in the corner, at the shape of her father's Harley underneath it. Tell that to Delacroix, Sandra said. He should know. I will, Claire said. Congratulations, Miss Whitmore, Sandra said. Build something that lasts. After she hung up, Claire stood at the workbench for a moment. Then she said, loud enough to carry across the shop, Marcus. The back went quiet. Yeah? He appeared in the doorway, she told him. The sound he made was not professional and not composed and was exactly right. Daniel looked up from across the shop with his mouth open. Carlos put down the part in his hand. Delacroix stood very still, looking at her and said, The shop is safe? The shop is safe, she said. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. It was not relief exactly, and it was more specific than that. It was the look of someone who has been afraid, for longer than they admitted, that the damage they caused was permanent and total, and who has just learned that permanence is not the same as finality. She crossed the shop to where he was standing. She said, as Sandra told me what pushed the decision. He looked at her. What you said at the TARP, she said. She included it in her report. A retired Marine colonel read it and told the board to fund us. Delacroix stared at her. What I said, he repeated. Word for word, she said. I can't undo the scratch, but I can be part of what comes after. He looked at the TARP. He looked at his hands. He put them in his pockets, and she could see the effort it took him to keep his face level, and she decided to give him the dignity of not watching too closely. And she turned back to the shop and said, All right, we've got work to do. She called Ray from the parking lot because some things needed air around them. He picked up before the second ring. Tell me, he said. She told him. He didn't make the sound this time. He was quiet for a long moment, the quiet of someone letting something real land without rushing past it. Rudy, he said finally. Just the name. Just that. I know, she said. He would have been, Claire, he would have been. I know, Ray. A long pause. When are we starting on the bike, he said, and she knew when. She had known since Sandra said build something that lasts, had known it the way you know things that arrive not as decisions but as recognitions, something that was already true becoming visible. Tomorrow morning, she said, 6 o'clock, before anyone else gets here. I'll bring coffee, he said. Bring the good stuff, she said, not the gas station kind. Rudy drank gas station coffee his whole life. Rudy is not here to defend that choice, she said. Ray laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and true. She heard 40 years of friendship in it. She heard her father in it, refracted through the person who had known him longest and most honestly. 6 o'clock, Ray said. I'll be there at 5:50. She knew he would. She called Gerald Fitch next. He picked up on the third ring with the careful hello of a man braced for continued difficulty. Gerald, she said, I have the funding. A pause. The grant came through? The grant came through, she said. Full amount, 3-year commitment. Another pause, longer. Claire, he said. Then nothing after that for a moment. Then, my mother would have loved this. I know, she said. She talked about you, about your father first, and then you. He cleared his throat. She said Rudy Whitmore was the kind of man who made the street better just by being on it. He was, Claire said. She said the same about you. He cleared his throat again. I'm going to tell the development company I'm not selling. Claire was quiet. I know it cost me something, he said. I've been running the numbers. I can manage. The building's been in the family since my grandfather built it. I think, he stopped. I think some things are worth the cost. She thought about her father saying a motorcycle is not made of metal, it carries someone's memories. She thought about how that was true of buildings too, of streets, of every place where something real had happened between people who meant something to each other. Thank you, Gerald, she said. Don't lose the building, he said gruffly, and hung up. She stood in the parking lot and felt the October air on her face and thought that the world was occasionally, unpredictably, in the most ordinary and surprising ways, exactly what it should be. She called Ray back. Change of plans, she said. What's wrong? Nothing, she said. I want to start tonight. A beat. The bike? The bike, she said. Now, come now. Claire, it's 4 o'clock. Ray, come now. She heard him stand up, heard the familiar sound of keys. 20 minutes, he said. He was there in 17. They stood together in front of the uncovered Harley for a long time without doing anything. This was right. This was the correct way to begin. Not with tools, not with assessment, but with presence, with looking, with the acknowledgement that what you were about to work on deserved more than efficiency. Ray had his coffee in his hand, the good kind. He'd stopped somewhere on the way. He looked at the scratch on the tank for a long moment. Kids did that with a key, he said. Key, she confirmed. He shook his head slowly, not in anger, in the way you shake your head at something that is beyond a certain kind of comprehension. The seat, he said. I know. The leather is, I know, Ray. He put his hand flat on the tank, the same gesture her father had used 24 years ago in a garage in South Phoenix when she was 18 and thought she knew everything. The same gesture that had given her the first sentence of the language she'd spent the rest of her life learning to speak. He stood like that for a moment. Okay, Rudy, he said quietly. We got her. Claire picked up the first tool. She started at the seat because the seat was the hardest thing, and she had learned from her father and from 20 years of working on machines that you start with the hardest thing when you're strongest, not when you're tired, not when you have already spent yourself on the easier problems. She examined the cut in the leather for a long time close up with the work light angled directly on it. The cut was clean. Whatever was used had been sharp, and it ran diagonally across the center of the seat. The leather itself was original, 40 years old, dried to a specific texture that modern leather didn't have, that you couldn't replicate with new material because the process of being ridden for 40 years was not something you could manufacture. The stitching along the cut's path had separated, and the stuffing beneath showed through, compressed and aged. Mendez, she said. Ray looked at her. Roberto Mendez, she said, out in Tucson. He does restoration leather, old stuff. I've sent him 3 seats in the last 2 years. Can he match it? He can't replace it, she said, but he can repair it in a way that holds the original. He told me once that his job is to make the repair invisible while making the leather strong. She looked at the seat. He's the only person I trust with this. Call him, Ray said. It's 4:30. Call him. She called him. Roberto Mendez answered on the second ring, and when she described the seat, the age of the leather, the nature of the cut, he was quiet for a moment and then said, Bring it to me, this weekend. I want to see it in person before I tell you what's possible. What if it's not repairable, she said. Everything is repairable, Roberto said. The question is whether the repair tells the right story. A pause. Bring it to me. She hung up. Tucson this weekend, she said to Ray. I'll ride with you, he said. You don't have to. Claire. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Rudy rode with me when Linda left the first time. He drove 12 hours round trip to sit with me in a parking lot outside a bar in Flagstaff and make sure I didn't do something I couldn't undo. He paused. Tucson is 2 hours. I'll ride with you. She looked at him. Okay, she said. They worked through to the evening, not on everything, not trying to solve the whole bike in one session, but doing what the first session was for, assessing completely, documenting what needed what, making the ordered list that would become the weeks of work ahead. The mirror bracket, the paint on the tank, the seat to Tucson, the fuel line that had a small crack she'd noticed 3 months before the parking lot and had meant to address and hadn't, the chrome on the exhaust that the parking lot incident had chipped along the lower edge. She cataloged everything. She was good at this, at seeing the whole scope of the damage before beginning, at not flinching from it. Her father had taught her this too. Don't look away from what's broken, he'd said. Looking away just means you will be surprised later. Look straight at it. Know exactly what you're dealing with. Then start. She looked straight at it. She knew exactly. Then she started. 3 weeks later, Roberto Mendez called her on a Tuesday. Come get your seat, he said. She drove to Tucson alone early before the shop opened. Ray had offered. Marcus had offered. Daniel, who had in the past month begun showing up to the shop on weekends voluntarily, without being asked, to work on his own with a manual and whatever project Claire left accessible, had offered to come along in the way young people offer things when they want to be part of something without quite knowing how to say that. She went alone. Roberto's shop was small and specific, the shop of a man who had spent his life doing one thing with the kind of depth that turns a skill into an art. He had the seat on the workbench when she arrived, and he stepped back when she came in, the way craftsmen do when they're presenting something they know is right and want the other person to see it without their voice in the way. She stood in front of it. The repair was there. She could see it, not because it was obvious, but because she knew the seat well enough to see the seam line that hadn't been there before, the specific shade of the thread that was a near match but not a perfect match, the slight difference in surface texture where the new work met the old. But the leather was whole. It was the same leather, the same 40 years, the same stitching her father had put in himself along the edges, untouched, still holding. The cut was closed. The seat was not as it was the night of the parking lot. It was as it was before the parking lot, with one addition, a repair that told the story of what had happened to it and had been survived. She ran her finger along the repair line. The thread is as close as I could get, Roberto said. The original thread is a waxed cotton that hasn't been manufactured in 20 years. I have a supplier in New Mexico who finds old stock. It's right, she said. It's honest, he said. It doesn't pretend the damage didn't happen. It shows that the damage was addressed. She looked at it for a long moment. Roberto, she said, what do I owe you? He told her a number that was less than she expected. She looked at him. My grandfather was a veteran, he said. He didn't have anybody like you when he came back. He turned away, back to his bench. Take it. She took it. She drove back to Phoenix with her father's seat on the passenger seat of her truck, buckled in with a seatbelt because she was not taking any chances. And she talked to it the way people talk to things that carry the people they've lost. She said the things she hadn't gotten to say enough when he was alive. Not the dramatic things, not the speeches, but the ordinary things, the day-to-day accumulation of a daughter and a father, all the small dailies that stop when someone is gone, and that you miss more than the large moments, because the large moments are finite and the small ones were supposed to go on forever. She told him about the parking lot. She told him about Ray and the 51 bikes. She told him about Gerald Fitch and Sandra Kellerman and a retired Marine colonel she'd never met who had read Brandon Delacroix's words and told a board to fund something important. She told him about Daniel Reeves, who had arrived on a Monday at 6:52, 3 minutes before Delacroix, and who had started, without being asked, reading her father's copy of the Harley-Davidson factory service manual that she kept on the shop shelf, because he wanted to understand the bike from the beginning. She said, Dad, there's a kid in my shop who showed up to break something and started wanting to understand it instead. I think you would have liked him. She said, the seat is fixed. Roberto fixed it. You can still see where it was cut. I'm going to keep it that way. She said, I think that's right, don't you? Keeping the repair visible, so it's part of the story instead of hidden underneath it. She drove through the October desert, and the light was the kind of light that happens in that part of the country in that part of the year. And the truck was warm, and her father's seat was beside her. And she was not sad, and she was not happy, but she was something more complete than either of those things. She was fully present in the fact of the life she had built, and the people in it, and the machine she was going to restore, and the road that would carry it forward. She was her father's daughter. That was always going to be enough. The restoration of the 2009 Harley Road King took 11 weeks. 11 weeks during which the shop on Cochise Street ran on grant funding for the first time in its existence, which meant Claire could pay Marcus properly for the first time, could order parts without the calculation that had been her constant companion for 15 years. 11 weeks during which Lena Chu got on her Sportster for the first time and came back to the shop 20 minutes later with her face doing the same thing Gus's had done. That particular reckoning of someone who had been told something was over and has just discovered that over is not a fixed address. 11 weeks during which Brandon Delacroix served out his 200 hours and then, on the morning his final day was complete, stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment and then came back inside and said to Claire, "I want to keep coming." She looked at him. "Not for the court," he said. "Not because I have to." He looked at the bikes in progress. At the Harley, which was in the final stages of reassembly, the tank repainted in the original black, the new mirror brackets fitted, the seat back in place with its honest visible repair. "I want to learn the rest of it." "The rest of it takes years," she said. "I know," he said. "You'd be starting at the bottom," she said, "and sweeping floors, sorting parts, same as when you walked in." "I know," he said. "And if a veteran comes in who has a problem with you being here, their comfort is the priority, not yours." He nodded. "That's fair." She studied him. 3 months ago, Brandon Delacroix had stood in a parking lot and laughed at a woman he believed couldn't fight back. He had been wrong about the woman. He had been wrong about the fighting. He had been wrong, most fundamentally, about what power was and where it lived and what it was actually for. Han had spent 11 weeks learning the correct version. "Monday," she said, 7 o'clock. He nodded. He didn't smile because this was not a moment that called for celebration. It called for seriousness, for the seriousness of a person stepping into something they understood was larger than themselves and intended to honor it. He left. She watched him go. Daniel at the workbench said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did you just hire him?" "I invited him to keep learning," she said. "Is that different?" "Ask me in a year," she said. The day she finished the Harley, she called Ray. She did not tell him it was done. She just said, "Come to the shop." He heard something in her voice and came without asking. He walked through the door and stopped. The Road King was in the center of the floor, fully assembled. The black paint had been matched as closely as was possible, not identical, because the original had 40 years of sun and road on it that no new paint could replicate, and she had not tried to replicate it. The new paint was fresh and clean and sat alongside the older panels that she'd left original, and the difference was visible, and she had left it that way deliberately. The tank had been color matched on the scratch panel, and the rest had been left as it was, weathered and real. The seat carried Roberto's repair across its center, the thread slightly different, honest. The new mirror brackets held new mirrors that were the correct vintage style, not identical to the originals because the originals were gone, but right in the way things can be right without being identical. The bike was not the same as before the parking lot. It was the same bike. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference was the entire point. Ray stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Rudy." Just the name. Then he put his hand on the tank. Claire watched him stand there with his hand on the tank the way her father had stood 40 years ago and the way she had stood 100 times since. And she thought about what Sandra Kellerman had said, that the shop was not a program, but an argument, that people could be restored, not to what they were before, but to themselves, with the damage made honest and the repair made strong and the road still ahead of them. "Are you going to ride it?" Ray said. "Yes," she said. "When?" She looked at the bike, at everything it carried, at her father's stitching along the seat edges, touched, still holding. At the mark on the tank that wasn't quite a mark anymore, but wasn't quite gone either. The ghost of the scratch, beneath the new paint, invisible and permanent simultaneously. "Now," she said. She got on. She put her hands on the bars. She sat there for a moment with the engine off, just being on it, just letting the weight of it settle under her the way it always had. The specific balance of this particular machine that she had known since she was a girl, watching her father mount it with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in one place in the world. She started the engine. The sound it made was the same sound it had always made. Engines don't change when the chrome chips or the paint scratches or the mirrors break. The engine is the engine. The heart of the thing runs on regardless. She looked at Ray. He was smiling, not the almost smile, the real one. She pulled out of the shop and onto Cochise Street, and then she rode the way her father had ridden, the way she had always ridden, not to get somewhere in particular, but because the road was its own reason, because forward motion was its own argument, because there are things that can only be understood in movement, and this was one of them. She rode through Phoenix in the October morning, past the VA office where the flyer had been on the wall, past the Dusty Spoon 60 miles out, because she needed to pass it, because the road that started there needed to be ridden through. She did not stop. She rode past it at 60 miles an hour and did not look away. She rode until the desert opened up completely around her, until it was just the road and the engine and the sky, in the particular silence that is not silence at all, but the sound of everything that matters reduced to its simplest form. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way you think about someone when you're doing the thing they taught you to do. Not with grief, not with the ache that had been her companion for 11 years, but with something cleaner and more honest than grief. With gratitude. With the recognition that some people leave such a specific and irreplaceable shape in the world that the world itself carries their outline long after they're gone, and that if you look at the right things in the right light, you can still see them. She looked at the road ahead. She saw him. She rode. And the Harley rode king that was not made of metal but of memories, of every mile and every refusal to quit, and every morning that had to be gotten through, and every lesson passed from a father to a daughter in a garage that smelled like oil and possibility, carried her forward exactly as it was always built to do, on the road that had no end, in the light that was her father's and hers and everyone's, who had ever understood that freedom is not given and cannot be destroyed, only interrupted, and that the people who understand this are the ones the road belongs to. That was the truth of Claire Whitmore. That was what 4 young men had accidentally introduced to the world when they touched something they believed was just a bike. And the world, once it knew the truth, did not forget it.